Is the reason why undercover journalists fell out of favor because of the lawsuits, in your opinion, in review?
No, I think it's. I'm not sure that undercover journalism is really out of favor. Out of favor
In
as
the
you
legacy
say.
media, in the
Legacy
network
media.
news.
I don't know is the honest answer. I don't really know why it fell out of favor. I think because it becomes a bit gotcha-ish.
Yeah.
It's like when it's really valid, when you have a unique situation. I think in the old days when he was still doing real journalism, Scott Pelley did an investigation into stem cells. And, there was a real argument for having undercover journalists recording what this guy was doing and then confronting him with it. But I know what Mike Wallace felt, because I talked to Mike about this, was that it became sort of, and I talked to other people at 60 Minutes about it too, is that this idea that it became kind of, now they're doing it just for the sake of, because they have to do it, because it's become this signature that you ambush people and you do this and that. And I think that's what happens, is when you have to deliver it, not because the story merits it completely. You choose to do that because you're trying to deliver undercover journalism where you could have just confronted people openly. And then it becomes a caricature of itself and it loses its value.
I watched that segment of Wallace when he was retiring, or there was some segment in the early 2000s when he was looking back at his career, and he said it became about, I don't remember the quote, heat rather than, it became more about heat rather than the actual truth. But one of the things that I've struggled with as a journalist is balancing harm versus public interest. Have you ever, I'm sure you've thought about this, just
of course.
the harm to, so every great journalism, this is a quote by Leonard Downey, who's an old school 70s reporter. He said, well, but what's never be forgotten is an investigative reporter must face the fact that his stories hurt people. And let me make this less abstract. I was in court the other day, federal court. I'm in court like every week. And I was testifying, and their argument was, we want to get a restraining order, or what's called a stay on discovery, meaning James needs to stop deposing witnesses and publishing the proceeding because random people are giving death threats to my, client. A random person is giving you a death threat, so you want to shut down my ability to speak? But this is a common tension, is it not, in journalism? Because the stuff that Mike Wallace used to do, I mean, you guys were taking people down. Sometimes they deserved it, but you're just showing the truth. And that does harm the individual, does it?
Well, I mean, Lance Armstrong, good example, right? I mean, when 60 Minutes exposed that Lance Armstrong had lied and he was really doing steroids, that hurt Lance Armstrong. But you could argue that he did it to himself. And he lied and he was dishonest and he profited. And so that's a pretty easy example.
That's
right?
an easy example.
That's an easy one. But of course, journalism hurts people. That's why I've always said it's subjective. We make decisions all the time that are very, very subjective. And our objectivity comes more if you take refuge in the process and of how you're making those decisions and giving people a fair chance to respond and so on. Abu Ghraib, 60 Minutes held on to that story for weeks because the Department of Defense asked them, because there were real consequences and they wanted a chance to figure out how to do damage control. Of course, it was impossible because the damage was just so, egregious that there was no controlling it. But you make a subjective decision. But it's precisely because journalism does hurt people that you need to be very careful about how you wield that power. And just because you have that power doesn't automatically mean it should be wielded. I was tasked with doing a story once on sudden adult death syndrome. I had to call up a dad whose son had just dropped dead. And he said to me, "Why should I talk to you?" I didn't have a good answer for him. And he said, "Is it going to bring my son back?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "Well, then all it's going to do is cause me pain." I said, "I understand." And he said, "So I'm not going to talk to you." I said, "You know what, sir? If I were in your shoes, I wouldn't either." And I have the phone. I had to go tell my boss I failed. I didn't have that story. I couldn't deliver because it wasn't worth it to me. I wasn't going to lie to that man, give him some nonsense story about how it was going to save other kids. No, it wasn't going to do that. And he was in pain. So, for me, I've always believed, and I've always told you this, you do the right thing for the right reasons. You be a good person. And you put those ethical considerations first. Remember, I've always said the story does not come first.
I remember you were helping me, coach me through a story about a CNN person who
wanted to have sex with his girlfriend's, his fiance's
Yes,
daughter,
you
and they were
remember.
getting married.
And that was a tough one, and I take the ethics very seriously, but it's
And
hard.
I was harsh with you that day.
I remember.
I was harsh with you because you were locked in all the journalistic part of it, and I
Yeah.
said, James, stop. And you had already been to the police. You tried to talk to them. You tried to talk
Tried
to the
everything.
mom, and you said to me, she doesn't want to have anything to do with us because she's CNN, and he's CNN, her boyfriend, and she doesn't
Rick
want to
Salibi
talk to
was
us.
the name
Yeah.
of the guy. Our audience has no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Rick's, maybe we pull up this in post-production.
He was the CNN producer who was
Yeah.
marrying this woman, and he was speaking to a prostitute who was your source.
And I spoke to the prostitute who eventually blew the whistle and came
because he was
public
telling her about his sexual fantasies
with the underage
with
situation.
this woman he was marrying. And I said to you,
Yes.
go back to the mother 100 times if you have to.
Yeah.
Don't stop until you get her to listen to you. And if you don't get any joy from the police, go to the FBI. And if they don't speak to you, go to this person and that person. But your only job right now is to make sure that that man doesn't get near that girl.
I think
And you did it.
You should teach a master class in journalism ethics. That's a good idea, actually. But that
I might be working on something like that
I
in
hope,
the early
I
stages.
hope you are, because you're. I mean, this is a compliment. Like I've read for American Muckrake, I must have read 100 books on journalism ethics because I find it weirdly fascinating. I don't know how to balance that, and that also I think we were talking about this before the show. When you were at 60 Minutes, how many times did you watch your segments before they aired?
Oh, hundreds.
Hundreds of times.
Easily, hundreds of times.
And what did you do for 60 Minutes?
Well, I was a correspondent. I became a full-time correspondent there, which was, that was the holy grail. It was the pinnacle of journalism.
A pinnacle of journalism. How many segments did you do for 60 Minutes approximately?
Oh, I did. I don't remember exactly.
That aired
but
on
many,
Sunday.
Many. I was there for 16 years. At 60 Minutes
years.
too, and then at 60 Minutes. And by the time I left, I was working up to 20 pieces a season. I wasn't there yet.
20 pieces a season. There's only 54 shows in a year, something like that, right?
Yeah. Well, you had a staple of like 5 or 6 full-time correspondents, and we worked with multiple producers. And so you, as the correspondent, could be working on 3, 4, 5 stories at a time.
And you did all these stories, and you watched them hundreds of times each before they aired.
Oh yeah.
And you were concerned about every word.
Every word.
It was very
Every
careful.
frame.
Every frame.
Oh yeah.
And
absolutely, every frame.
And
every
now,
second counted.
And now, they're just free flowing conversations.
Yeah.
How many times, when you do the Spotify episodes, do you watch them hundreds of times after?
No. Who's got the time to do that? If you put out a 2-hour or 3-hour episode, you can't watch that over and over again.
So when I did the recent Epstein stories, I did them very much not to the degree you did at 60 Minutes, but they were television magazine style presentations. And I saw a few in the comments. Just talk to us, man. You don't need to put on a suit and who, what, when, where, why us to death. And I again, this is like the journalism nerd in me. I don't know how much this interests my audience, but I find this fascinating. Because as a journalist, don't you have to kind of identify what the lead is from all of this stuff and bring it forth in a clear and concise and cogent way?
Yes.
But people aren't. Well, let me ask you: are people doing that these days? I just see a bunch of stuff online.
No, less and less and less. It's not happening very much. Journalism is in real trouble because it's dying, and people are celebrating its death because they've been abused by it. Right? We've been hurt as a nation. Many people, millions of people have been hurt by it. We've been lied to over and over again. It's affected elections. It's affected. People died because journalists lied about COVID. And they had every opportunity to know the truth. Not every single one of them, but most of them. If I could figure it out, somebody else could figure it out. You know what I mean? It's not like I'm so much I'm so unique or so much better than somebody else. No. I mean, there's lots of journalists with good sources and with a solid head on their shoulders who are smart enough to figure it out. But people actually died because journalists stopped holding them accountable and just let them feed their propaganda out there and didn't ask the most basic, obvious questions. Here's an example. When the Christopher Steele dossier came out, remember that? Christopher Steele. Okay, so this was it. This was now everybody's got Trump, right? Because he's cavorting in Russia and supposedly, with prostitutes and having them pee on him. That's what was in this dossier that they all wanted to call unverified, but treated as if it was, set in stone.
I remember when
more
Ben
powerful than
Smith
the
at
Bible.
BuzzFeed, speaking of journalism subjectivity, he wanted to put the document out there. And I remember this is BuzzFeed News,
Yeah.
published it. I remember that.
Yeah, but all the journalists were calling it the unverified dossier, right?
Right, and they
So then-
published it.
But why are you reporting on it as if it's verified? When you're covering your ass, that's what you're doing,
Yeah.
covering your butt, so that you can still use it. Because anyone with half a brain who reads that document knows that it's sheer and utter nonsense.
The difference between propaganda and journalism is verification.
Yes, of course. And on top of that, there wasn't a single first-hand source in that dossier.
Right.
There wasn't even a second-hand source. You're talking about third, fourth, fifth.
So people have just they wanted the media's demise, but now you have the rise of citizen journalism.
Well, no, they still want the media's demise, but they've been deceived again.
But in
because
terms
they've
of-
been told there's no value. We don't lose anything. You lose journalism, you only gain, and that's not true.
That's not true. What is your price? Because if your price is not your life,